Close your eyes and settle into a comfortable position as we journey back to the very beginning of Pokémon. Not to Pallet Town or Professor Oak's laboratory, but further still, to a small apartment in Tokyo where a handful of artists and programmers were sketching the foundations of what would become the biggest media franchise in history. This is the story of Rhydon, the forgotten first, and the secrets buried deep within Generation 1's chaotic development. The first sketch picture a workspace in early 1990. Ken Sugimori sits hunched over his desk, pencil moving across graph paper in careful, measured strokes. Around him, the small Game Freak office buzzes with the energy of possibility. Satoshi Tajiri has just pitched an ambitious concept to Nintendo, something he's calling Capsule Monsters, a game about collecting creatures and connecting Game Boys with link cables. It's a wild idea, one that Nintendo executives don't fully understand, but Shigeru Miyamoto sees potential and agrees to mentor the project. Sugimori needs to create the first monster. He thinks about the kaiju films he loved as a child, those towering beasts from Godzilla and Ultraman that stomp through miniature cities. He thinks about dinosaurs, prehistoric creatures that once ruled the earth. His pencil begins to form something brutish and powerful, a rhinoceros crossed with elements of dinosaur design, with a drill-like horn and thick armored hide. The creature that emerges from his imagination stands upright on two legs, muscular and imposing, with a tail thick enough to topple buildings. This is Rhydon, though it doesn't have a name yet, just a place in Sugimori's sketchbook as Monster Number 1. What makes this moment so significant isn't just that Rhydon came first chronologically. It's that this single design established the entire visual language that would define Pokémon for decades to come. Sugimori was experimenting with how much detail could fit into a tiny Game Boy sprite, how to make a creature recognizable at such a small scale. He was figuring out proportions, thinking about how these monsters would move, battle, and exist in the game world. Every pencil stroke was solving a problem that hundreds of future Pokémon would inherit. In those earliest concept documents, the ones from the Capsule Monsters pitch that Game Freak presented to Nintendo, Rhydon appears again and again. It's there in the sprite sheets demonstrating how creatures would look in various poses. It's there in battle mock-ups showing how two monsters would face off on a Game Boy screen, while other early designs like Lapras and Clefairy were also being developed around this same period, according to multiple interviews with Sugimori and evidence from the game's internal structure. Rhydon appears to be the very first design that made it all the way from concept to implementation, the one that started everything. The reasoning behind Rhydon's dinosaur-like appearance runs deeper than simple aesthetic preference. In the earliest stages of development, Tajiri and Sugimori envisioned a world where all the pocket monsters would be based on prehistoric creatures or kaiju. The game's original concept leaned heavily into this monster battling genre, inspired by tokusatsu shows where giant beasts clashed in spectacular fashion. Rhydon embodied this vision perfectly, a creature that looked like it had stepped out of the Mesozoic era, but with just enough cartoonish exaggeration to fit the style that they were crafting. Look closely at Rhydon's design and you'll notice elements that became staples of Pokémon design philosophy. The exaggerated features, the clear silhouette readable even at low resolution, the blend of real-world animal inspiration with fantastical elements. Sugimori wasn't just drawing a monster, he was establishing rules. The horn needed to be prominent because it would be Rhydon's defining feature. The body needed to be stocky and grounded because this was clearly a powerhouse, not a swift creature. Even the small details, like the segmented armor plates and the slight hunch in its posture, were decisions that taught Sugimori what worked and what didn't on the Game Boy's limited hardware. As the design team grew beyond just Sugimori, other artists joined to create the original 151 Pokémon, but Rhydon remained special. Based on its position in the game's code and its appearance throughout early development documents, it seems to have served as the template, the proof of concept. It's reasonable to infer that when programmers needed to test how sprite data would load into memory, they would have turned to Rhydon since it was already implemented. The creature's role as the first design would naturally make it the reference point when the team debated whether new designs were too complex or too simple. This likely explains why statues throughout the Kanto region's gyms bear a resemblance to Rhydon's general shape. While the exact identity of these statues has been debated among fans for years, the stocky build and prominent features suggest they may have started as early placeholder designs based on Rhydon's silhouette before being stylized into more generic monster icons. Memory constraints meant the developers reused assets wherever possible, and Rhydon's prominence in early development would have made it a natural reference point. Whether intentional tribute or practical necessity, these statues hint at Rhydon's foundational role in ways most players never noticed. The transition from that first sketch to a working sprite was its own journey. Sugimori's art had to be translated into pixels by other team members, compressed down to a tiny grid that the Game Boy could handle. Colors had to be limited to just a few shades of gray on the original Japanese releases. Every single pixel mattered because memory was so constrained. And through all these technical limitations and transformations, Rhydon had to remain recognizable, its essential character intact. What Sugimori couldn't have known in that moment, pencil scratching across paper in a small Tokyo office, was that this one design would indirectly influence nearly 1,000 future Pokémon across 9 generations of games. The design philosophy he was inventing with Rhydon, the way he balanced power with approachability, detail with simplicity, would echo through every creature that followed. Rhydon was the first brushstroke on a blank canvas that would eventually become the most valuable media franchise in the world. The Capsule Monsters era. To understand why Rhydon came first, we need to step back even further into Satoshi Tajiri's childhood in Machida, a suburb of Tokyo. Young Tajiri was known among his friends as Dr. Bug, a nickname earned through his obsessive dedication to catching insects. He would spend entire afternoons exploring rice paddies and forests, jar in hand, searching for beetles and butterflies. He studied their habitats, learned their behaviors, discovered the thrill that came from finding a rare specimen. This wasn't casual play, it was a passionate collection hobby that consumed his free time. But as the 1970s gave way to the 80s, Machida began to change. The fields where Tajiri hunted bugs were paved over for apartment buildings. The forests were cleared for shopping centers. His favorite fishing pond was demolished to make room for an arcade. The natural world he loved was disappearing, replaced by concrete and commerce. Rather than mourning this loss, Tajiri found a new obsession in those arcades, spending hours playing Space Invaders and Missile Command, studying the patterns, chasing high scores. This dual passion for collecting and for video games would eventually merge into a single vision. In 1981, at just 16 years old, Tajiri started a fanzine called Game Freak, a handwritten magazine about arcade games that he sold at specialty bookstores for 200 yen. The magazine included strategy guides, Easter eggs, tips for achieving high scores. It was through this fanzine that Tajiri met Ken Sugimori, a young artist who sent in illustrations and eventually became a regular collaborator. By 1989, Game Freak had transformed from a fanzine into a legitimate video game development company. Tajiri and Sugimori began creating their own games, learning the craft through titles like Quinty for the Famicom. They were developing skills, building a team, establishing relationships with publishers like Namco and Nintendo. But Tajiri had a bigger idea brewing, something that would combine his childhood love of collecting with the connectivity of Nintendo's new Game Boy handheld. The inspiration struck when Tajiri saw two children playing together with their Game Boys connected by a link cable. The image that flashed through his mind was vivid and immediate. Insects crawling along that cable between the two systems. What if you could create a game about collecting creatures and trading them with friends? What if the act of connection itself was central to the gameplay? The concept coalesced quickly after that. Players would explore a world filled with wild monsters, capturing them in capsules inspired by the gashapon vending machines popular in Japan that dispensed toys in plastic balls. They could train these monsters to battle, trade rare specimens with friends, and work toward completing a full collection. Tajiri called this concept capsule monsters, writing up a pitch document and creating illustrated materials to present to Nintendo in 1990. This pitch booklet, which has been partially revealed in Japanese television documentaries and gaming magazines, contained roughly 100 pages of concept art, gameplay descriptions, and design philosophy. Sugimori provided the illustrations, including those early sprite sheets showing Rhydon, Clefairy, Lapra, and other prototype creatures. The pitch explained that these capsule monsters would have different roles in human society. Some would be pets, cute companions like Clefairy. Others would be helpers, creatures that could carry people across water like Lapras, or move heavy objects like Rhydon. Still others would be more monstrous, dangerous wild creatures that needed to be approached with caution. This role-based design thinking would eventually evolve into the type system, but in these early days the focus was more on how humans and monsters would coexist. One fascinating detail from the original capsule monsters concept is that catching wasn't done through battle. Instead, players had a charisma stat, and they would need to convince wild creatures to join them through some form of interaction mechanic. The exact details remain unclear, but this shows how much the core gameplay would change during development. The version that eventually released relied on weakening monsters through battle before throwing a Pokeball, a much more action-oriented approach than the original vision. Nintendo was intrigued by Tajiri's pitch but didn't fully grasp the concept. The idea of trading as a core mechanic was particularly alien. Up until that point, the Game Boy's link cable had been used almost exclusively for competitive head-to-head play in games like Tetris. Using it for cooperation and exchange was genuinely innovative. But Tajiri's reputation from his previous work, combined with Miyamoto's willingness to mentor the project, convinced Nintendo to greenlight development. There was just one problem. Tajiri couldn't trademark the name Capsule Monsters. It was too similar to the Capsule Kaiju from the Ultraman franchise, and there were legal concerns about infringement. The team tried a few variations, briefly calling it Kapumon, then Kapumon, before finally settling on Pocket Monsters. This name better captured the idea of creatures small enough to fit in your pocket, portable companions, for a portable game system. The Japanese audience would eventually shorten this to Pokémon, and that abbreviated form would become the international name when the games finally reached Western markets. The Capsule Monsters pitch represented a moment of pure creative freedom. Tajiri and Sugimori were inventing something entirely new, unburdened by the expectations of an existing franchise. They could experiment with wild ideas, draw inspiration from their favorite childhood shows and hobbies, let their imaginations run wild across those 100 pages of concept art. Rhydon wasn't just the first design, it was the first step into unknown territory, a test to see if they could actually build the world they were imagining. As development officially began, the team had to start making difficult choices. According to Sugimori in interviews, they designed over 300 Pokémon in total, but only 151 would make it into the final games. Memory limitations on the Game Boy cartridge would force ruthless cuts. Entire evolutionary lines were scrapped. Complex designs that couldn't be rendered clearly at low resolution were simplified or abandoned. Some 3-stage evolution families were reduced to 2 stages because each form required precious space for sprites and data. But through all these changes and compromises, Rhydon remained. It survived every cut, every revision, every technical constraint. Part of this was practical. As the first design, it had been used in so much testing and prototyping that removing it would have created cascading problems throughout the codebase. But part of it was sentimental too. Rhydon was where it all started, the proof that this crazy idea could actually work. It had earned its place in the final lineup through sheer historical significance, development hell. The story of Pokémon Red and Green's development is one of the most harrowing in video game history. What Tajiri and his team accomplished between 1990 and 1996 borders on miraculous, a testament to obsessive dedication and the willingness to sacrifice everything for a vision. The fact that Rhydon survived this journey, emerging with its place as index number 001 intact, speaks to how fundamental it was to the project's identity. Game Freak in the early 90s was not a large company. When development on Pocket Monsters began, the team consisted of perhaps a dozen people, many of them working part-time or juggling multiple roles. Tajiri served as director and lead designer. Sugimori was art director, though he had help from a small team of artists, including Atsuko Nishida, who would design beloved Pokémon like Pikachu and the 3 Kanto starters. Junichi Masuda composed music, but also programmed and did sound design. Everyone wore multiple hats because there was no other choice. The Game Boy hardware presented immediate challenges. Released in 1989, it was already aging by the time Pocket Monsters entered development. The system had a tiny screen, just 160 by 144 pixels, displaying 4 shades of gray. It had minimal RAM and very limited cartridge space for storing game data. Making a complex role-playing game with over 100 unique creatures, dozens of moves, multiple towns and routes, and a trading system required programming gymnastics that pushed the hardware to its absolute limits. Memory became the constant enemy. Every feature, every Pokémon, every line of dialogue had to be measured in bytes. The team developed clever tricks to save space. Sound effects for different Pokémon cries were reused and pitch shifted rather than creating unique audio for each creature. Town tiles were recolored and reused across different locations. The developers wrote their code in Z80 assembly language, working directly with the hardware's memory rather than using higher-level languages, because assembly gave them precise control over every byte. One of the biggest memory hogs was the nicknaming feature. Allowing players to give custom names to their Pokémon required storing additional text data for every creature in their party and PC boxes. This might sound trivial, but when you're working with a cartridge that had less than 1 megabyte of total space, every feature had to justify its existence. At multiple points during development, the team had to choose between keeping nicknames or implementing other features. They always chose nicknames, recognizing that the ability to name your Pokémon created an emotional bond between player and creature that was essential to the game's vision. The decision to limit each Pokémon to knowing only 4 moves at a time also came from memory constraints, storing movesets, tracking which moves each Pokémon could learn, calculating damage in battles. All of this required data storage. Allowing unlimited moves would have been technically impossible on the Game Boy, but this limitation became a core strategic element of the game, forcing players to make meaningful choices about their team composition and move selection. Technical constraints bred creative design. Financial problems plagued the project from the start. Game Freak was a small company with limited funding. Development costs mounted as the years dragged on, and there were periods when the company could barely afford to pay its employees. Tajiri himself went without salary for stretches of time, relying on financial support from his father to cover basic living expenses. The work was grueling, with team members putting in long hours to keep the project moving forward despite the financial constraints. The pressure took its toll on the team. According to interviews in the biographical manga about Tajiri's life, 5 employees quit at one point when they learned how dire the financial situation had become. In another incident, all 3 of the programmers working on the project quit simultaneously, leaving the team scrambling to replace their expertise. These departures created enormous setbacks, as institutional knowledge walked out the door and new team members had to be brought up to speed on the complex codebase. To keep Game Freak afloat financially, the team had to pause Pocket Monsters development repeatedly to work on other games that would bring in immediate revenue. They developed Yoshi for Nintendo in 1991, a puzzle game that became a commercial success. They created Mario and Wario for the Super Famicom in 1993, a game that utilized the SNES mouse peripheral. They made Pulseman for Sega's Genesis console in 1994, an action platformer that received critical acclaim. Each of these projects was a detour, a necessary survival measure that delayed the Pokémon dream. But these detours also built expertise. Working on Yoshi taught the team about designing for a global market as the game saw a worldwide release. Creating Pulseman gave them experience with action game programming and sprite animation. Every project added skills and knowledge that would eventually feed back into Pokémon's development. The team was getting better as developers even as their main project languished on the back burner. By 1993, with around 80% of the music already composed and multiple years invested, Game Freak held an internal poll asking whether they should continue with Pocket Monsters or abandon it to focus entirely on other work. The vote came back in favor of continuing. Development resumed with renewed focus, though the financial struggles persisted. It was around this time that investment from Creatures Inc., the company that would later produce the Pokémon trading card game, provided crucial funding that allowed Game Freak to push toward completion. In exchange, Creatures received a 1/3 stake in the franchise rights, a deal that would prove astronomically valuable. Throughout all this chaos, Rhydon sat in the game's code as creature number 001, the first entry in the internal index that developers used to organize Pokémon data. This wasn't the same as the Pokédex number. Internally, Pokémon were organized roughly in the order they were programmed into the game, and Rhydon's position at the very beginning reflected its status as the original test case. When programmers needed to verify that battle systems were working, they'd spawn Rhydon. When artists needed to check how sprites loaded, they'd pull up Rhydon. It was the reference point, the known quantity in a sea of code. The localization for international release created entirely new problems. When Nintendo of America began preparing to bring Pocket Monsters to Western markets in 1997, they discovered that English text required significantly more memory space than Japanese text. Kanji characters allow Japanese writers to convey complex meanings in very few characters. English words, by contrast, are much longer on average. The original Japanese game had been designed with every available byte already allocated, leaving no room for expansion. Translators and programmers had to perform miracles to make the English version fit. Pokémon names were shortened. The Pokédex interface was redesigned to split information across multiple screens rather than displaying everything at once. The name entry screen was completely rebuilt. Flavor text was ruthlessly edited for brevity. This localization process took over 2 years, explaining the enormous gap between the Japanese release in February of 1996 and the North American launch in September of 1998. Despite all the technical compromises, the numerous glitches that remained in the final code, the financial near disasters and staff departures and years of grueling crunch, Pokémon Red and Green finally shipped on February 27, 1996. The initial print run was modest. Nintendo wasn't expecting a blockbuster. The Game Boy was aging hardware, and role-playing games weren't typically huge sellers in Japan. But word of mouth began to spread, particularly around the secret Pokémon Mew, whose existence had been kept hidden and could only be obtained through a glitch. Sales climbed steadily, then accelerated, then exploded into a full-blown phenomenon. Rhydon's hidden legacy. While Pikachu became the franchise mascot and Charizard captured imaginations worldwide, Rhydon's importance lives on in the game's code and design DNA in ways most players never notice. To find Rhydon's true legacy, you have to dig into the technical underpinnings of Pokémon Red and Blue, into the glitches and quirks that reveal how the games were actually constructed. That internal index number, 001, has fascinating implications. In Pokémon Red and Blue, every Pokémon has 2 numbers: its Pokédex number, the one players see, and its index number used internally by the game's code. These numbers are completely different. Bulbasaur might be number 001 in the Pokédex, but its index number is much higher because it was programmed into the game later in development. Rhydon, despite being number 112 in the Pokédex, sits at index 001 because it was literally the first creature entered into the game's data structure. This index system is why so many famous Pokémon glitches behave the way they do. When the game encounters corrupted data or tries to load a Pokémon with an invalid index number, it often defaults to Rhydon, the infamous missing number glitch, where players could encounter garbled creatures by performing a specific sequence of actions, sometimes resulted in these corrupted Pokémon transforming into Rhydon when viewed in the Pokédex. The game was essentially resetting to its default state, Index 001, the foundation on which everything else was built. The gym statues represent another piece of Rhydon's possible influence. In every Kanto gym, you'll find statues flanking the entrance, stocky creatures with horns perched atop pillars. For years, players debated what Pokémon these statues depicted. Some argued for Rhydon based on the general shape and horn. Others suggested they were deliberately generic, not meant to represent any specific species. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. These were placeholder assets created early in development that may have drawn from Rhydon's silhouette as a reference, then reused throughout the game because memory constraints made creating unique statues for each gym impractical. Whether or not they were specifically meant to be Rhydon, They reflect the practical realities of working within the Game Boy's limitations. There's even a famous fishing glitch involving these statues. Players discovered they could fish for Pokémon while standing in front of the gym statues by using an old rod, as if casting a line into solid stone. This quirk exists because of how the game checks for water tiles. The statues occupy spaces that the fishing code interprets as valid fishing spots, an unintentional side effect of how the game's tile system was implemented. It's a completely unintentional exploit that demonstrates the kind of unexpected interactions that emerge from the game's compressed, efficient code structure. The recycling of Rhydon's design elements extends to other Pokémon as well. Look closely at the stocky, bipedal build of Nidoking and Nidoqueen, both early designs that share Rhydon's kaiju-inspired aesthetic. Examine Kangaskhan's powerful stance and thickened tail. Study the armored plates on Golem and Sandslash. These aren't copies of Rhydon, but they're clearly informed by the design language that Sugimori established with that first sketch. The developers learned from Rhydon what worked at Game Boy Resolution, how to make a creature feel powerful and imposing despite the technical limitations, and they applied those lessons across dozens of other designs. Rhydon's dual ground and rock typing also established important precedents. It was one of the first Pokémon to demonstrate that types could be combined, that creatures didn't need to be pure fire or pure water, but could embody multiple elements simultaneously. This dual typing created interesting strategic depth, giving Rhydon both strengths and weaknesses that required players to think tactically. The decision to make it primarily a ground type rather than rock type also set a precedent. Most dual type combinations would eventually follow similar logic, with one type taking precedence over the other in terms of stab, same type attack bonus, and overall identity. In battle, Rhydon's stats reflected its role as an early design meant to showcase power. It had extremely high attack and defense, making it a physical tank that could dish out and absorb tremendous damage. Its special stats were low, creating a clear weakness that balanced its physical dominance. This stat distribution philosophy, having Pokémon excel in certain areas while being vulnerable in others, became fundamental to the series' strategic design. Not every creature could be good at everything. Specialization created diversity and made team building interesting. Rhydon even influenced the series' approach to evolution. As a middle-stage Pokémon, evolving from Rhyhorn, it demonstrated how creatures could grow stronger through leveling. Later, in Generation 4, Rhydon gained a third evolution into Rhyperior, requiring a held item trade to achieve. This addition proved that even the oldest Pokémon could be revisited and expanded in later games, that the design work from 1990 wasn't set in stone forever. Rhyperior's existence is a testament to how much the developers respect Rhydon's legacy. They chose to honor the first Pokémon with continued relevance across generations. The frequency with which Rhydon appears in the original games also hints at its importance. It's available in the Safari Zone, that late-game area where players hunt for rare Pokémon. It can be encountered in Victory Road, the final dungeon before the Elite Four. Giovanni, the final gym leader and leader of Team Rocket, uses Rhydon as one of his signature Pokémon, giving it prominent placement in the story. These weren't random choices. The developers wanted Rhydon visible and present, giving players opportunities to catch and use the creature that started it all, even if most of those players had no idea about its historical significance. Speedrunners and competitive battlers have also kept Rhydon relevant in ways the original developers never anticipated. Its high physical stats make it valuable in certain strategies, particularly in Generation 1 where the special stat combines special attack and special defense into one value. Rhydon's typing gives it useful resistances and access to powerful moves like Earthquake and Rock Slide. It's not the most powerful Pokémon in competitive play, but it occupies a niche that has ensured its continued use in certain battle formats even decades after release. The glitches and exploits surrounding Rhydon's code position have been documented and cataloged by the Pokémon speedrunning and ROM hacking communities. These technical enthusiasts have mapped out exactly how Rhydon's data is structured, where it sits in memory, how its sprites are compressed and loaded. Their work has revealed just how deeply Rhydon is embedded in the game's foundation, how many systems reference it as a default or starting point. To mod Pokémon Red and Blue, to alter or improve them, you inevitably have to work around or through Rhydon's data because it's so fundamental to how everything else functions, the foundation that built the franchise. When Ken Sugimori picked up his pencil in 1990 and sketched that first capsule monster, he couldn't have imagined the empire that would grow from it. But looking back across 35 years and nearly 1,000 Pokémon, Rhydon's influence echoes through every generation, every region, every design that followed. The dinosaur inspiration that defined Rhydon and the earliest Pokémon eventually gave way to a much broader design philosophy. By the time Gold and Silver entered development, the team had learned that dinosaurs and kaiju couldn't carry an entire roster. They needed cute Pokémon to appeal to younger players and girls. They needed mysterious Pokémon to fuel speculation and legend. They needed simple Pokémon that anyone could draw, and complex Pokémon that showcase the hardware's capabilities. The diversity that defines modern Pokémon can be traced back to the realization that Rhydon's aesthetic, while perfect for establishing the world, needed to be one voice in a much larger choir. This is actually visible in the original 151. Compare Rhydon to Pikachu, and you see the full spectrum Sugimori learned to work within. Rhydon is intimidating, powerful, clearly meant for battle. Pikachu is adorable, approachable, designed to be a companion. Both are equally valid expressions of what a Pokémon can be, but they serve completely different purposes. The fact that they coexist in the same game, the same world, is a direct result of the lessons learned during Generation 1's development. Atsuko Nishida, one of the artists who worked under Sugimori, came to the project with a talent for designing appealing, approachable creatures. The early roster, influenced by Sugimori's kaiju-inspired beginnings, skewed toward the more powerful and imposing. This created an opening for designs like Pikachu, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur that would become franchise icons, creatures that balanced Rhydon's imposing presence with accessibility and charm. The contrast suggests that Rhydon's establishment of one end of the design spectrum naturally created space for its opposite. The technical limitations that shaped Rhydon's creation also established workflows and tools that Game Freak would use for years. The sprite compression techniques that had to be developed to fit Rhydon and the other early Pokémon onto a Game Boy cartridge evolved into more sophisticated systems for later hardware. The animation frameworks that were likely first tested on Rhydon's battle movements became templates for how all Pokémon would move. The naming conventions, the data structures, the way Pokémon stats are organized in code. Many of these foundational decisions were made when implementing those very first creatures, with Rhydon at the forefront. Consider the evolution from Game Boy to Nintendo DS to Nintendo Switch. Each hardware leap brought new graphical capabilities, but the core design philosophy remained remarkably consistent. A Pokémon designed for the Switch today still needs a clear silhouette, distinctive features that make it recognizable at a distance, a balance between complexity and simplicity. These aren't arbitrary rules. They're the accumulated wisdom of decades of design iteration. And they began with Sugimori trying to make Rhydon work on a 160 by 144 pixel screen. The mythology that developed around Rhydon's hidden status is itself interesting. For years, most players had no idea it was the first Pokémon created. The information came from interviews with developers, from deep dives into the game's code, from dedicated fans piecing together development history. It wasn't promoted or advertised. It was a secret hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by those curious enough to look beneath the surface. This perfectly embodies Pokémon's layered design, where casual players can enjoy the adventure while hardcore fans uncover depths of strategy, lore, and technical detail. The trading card game, anime, manga, and other media adaptations all built on foundations established by the games, which in turn were established by creatures like Rhydon. Giovanni's signature Rhydon in the anime gave the Pokémon a personality and role it never had in the games. The trading cards explore different artistic interpretations of Rhydon across dozens of prints over the years. Each adaptation added new layers to the creature's identity while respecting its origins as a powerful, ground-dwelling beast. From a pure game design perspective, we can see how Rhydon likely influenced the developer's understanding of balance. Its quad weakness to water and grass moves, despite its impressive physical stats, demonstrates the principle that raw power needs counters. Its low speed stat meant it often moved last in battle, creating suspense and forcing players to think defensively. Whether these were intentional design choices from the start or lessons learned through testing, Rhydon exemplified a philosophy that would become central to Pokémon: meaningful weaknesses balancing significant strengths, making each creature interesting to use and fight against in different ways. The community that formed around Pokémon, the millions of players who have caught and trained Rhydon across multiple generations of games, have created their own meanings and memories with the creature. For some, Rhydon was a reliable team member that carried them through Victory Road. For others, it was a disappointing catch in the Safari Zone when they were hunting for Chansey. Still others remember Giovanni's Rhydon as a formidable opponent that tested their strategic thinking. These personal experiences, multiplied across hundreds of millions of players worldwide, give Rhydon a cultural weight that transcends its development history. Looking at modern Pokémon games, you can still see Rhydon's influence in unexpected places. The decision to create regional variants of older Pokémon in Sun and Moon echoes the idea that even the earliest designs deserve continued attention and reinterpretation. The raid battles and Dynamax mechanics in Sword and Shield play with scale and power in ways that feel directly descended from Rhydon's kaiju inspirations. The open-world exploration of Scarlet and Violet returns to Tajiri's original vision of capturing the joy of discovering creatures in the wild, the same joy that led to Rhydon's creation in the first place. As we close this journey through Rhydon's history and hidden legacy, it's worth reflecting on what this all means for the franchise. Pokémon succeeded not because of any single decision or design, but because of the accumulation of good choices, creative problem solving, and willingness to iterate and improve. Rhydon represents the beginning of that process, the first step in a journey spanning over 3 decades. The gray beast with the drill horn and armored hide will never achieve Pikachu's fame or Charizard's popularity. It will remain a mid-tier Pokémon in most players' minds, useful but not exceptional, present but not celebrated, and that's perfectly appropriate. Rhydon doesn't need to be the star because it already played its most important role. being first, being the test case, being the foundation that proved this crazy idea about pocket monsters could actually work. Every time a new Pokémon is designed, whether by Game Freak's internal team or by one of the external artists who now contribute to each generation, that Pokémon exists in a design space that Rhydon helped define. Every pixel, every type combination, every stat distribution, every animation, all of it builds on decades of collective knowledge that started with Ken Sugimori's pencil moving across paper. Rhydon is the foundation the franchise was built on, the cornerstone that everything else rests upon. It deserves recognition not for being the best or most iconic, but for being first, for being there at the beginning when everything was uncertain and the future was blank canvas. From that first sketch emerged a world that has captured billions of imaginations, generated hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, and created countless cherished memories. So the next time you encounter a Rhydon, whether in a dusty corner of the Safari Zone or on an opponent's team in Battle Stadium, take a moment to appreciate what you're seeing. This isn't just creature number 112. This is where Pokémon began. This is the secret origin hidden in plain sight. This is the first Pokémon ever created, and its legacy shapes everything you encounter in every Pokémon game you've ever played. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden history of Generation 1 and Rhydon's place in Pokémon development, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more secrets buried in the code of these games, stories about the people who made them, and details that most players never discover. Thanks for listening, and sweet dreams.